Alan, is that yours? Okay. Our next presenter is Mr. Alan Stagg. He is a graduate of the University of Tennessee with a degree in geology and is the president of Stagg Resource Consultants, Incorporated. He has more than 52 years' experience in the mineral industry, with the last 36 including an emphasis on mineral appraisals. He has conducted appraisals in more than 40 states and internationally. Stagg is a registered or licensed professional geologist in 14 states, a registered member of the SME, and a certified member of the International Institute of Mineral Appraisers. Alan?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying. Let me figure out which button's which. Obviously not that one. This talk, which I will try to get through as quick as I can, is based on a simple thesis or premise, if you will, that is kind of near and dear to my heart and my appraisal practice. And I'll go ahead and read it. The use of a single financial model in valuing mineral-bearing property or operation, even though characterized as being the most likely case, essentially implies in reaching an opinion of value that there is a 100% probability that the input used in constructing the model will occur and or that it is the approach that market participants would use. Income approach to value, the highlights, we don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to get everybody back in gear, it is widely accepted in valuing interest in real property, including mineral-bearing properties and operations. There are two basic methodologies, direct capitalization and yield capitalization. Direct capitalization, it's typically used in commercial real estate appraisals where you have an apartment building with a certain rent capacity factor and you've got some income and you get a direct capitalization factor and you divide it by that and you got your answer. I've seen real estate appraisers who took a foray into the mineral appraisal industry use the same approach on a mining property, and that just doesn't work because mining properties do not have level income. Every day is a new day in a mine. The volatility in the markets, the things we've talked about today. So my opinion is direct capitalization is not useful for a mineral property. Yield capitalization, a discounted cash flow analysis is by far the most common methodology. And that's probably self-evident to everyone in this room, but this is what I'm talking about here as far as doing models, financial models, is yield capitalization. The standard of value that most of us have to address most of the time, this is not always true and it depends on the specific circumstance, but generally is market value. And I think that is where sometimes we lose our way. I'm going to make a little editorializing. In my opinion, an appraiser is not the arbiter of value. It is not my position to decide on my own what I would pay for a property or what I think that property is worth. My job as an appraiser when doing a market value appraisal is to try to figure out what I think the market would pay for that property. And that is a very significant distinction, and I've seen a lot of times get off course because we start talking about, well, I think this and I think that, I don't believe that forecast and I don't believe this. And my response is, not to be too cute, although I've been accused of that, is it's not your job to figure out whether it's reasonable or unreasonable. If that's what market participants are basing their value on, then that's what you go with. You're not asked to necessarily judge that. You're asked to figure out what is the market going to do? What are the market participants going to do? And if the market participants use the EIA forecast, and some of us as professionals think that's not worth a crap, that's fine. But that's what market participants use, then that's how a market participant is going to determine what the value is that they will pay for it. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. Talk about a time lag. Whoops. Well, you all know the key elements of a fair market value or market value appraisal. The other thing to remember, and this gets off in the weeds sometimes too, is when you start talking about valuing mineral properties, you need to determine right up front what it is you're valuing. If you're valuing a fee simple property, we talked about this at lunch a little bit today, or even the severed mineral estate, and it is undeveloped and unleased, then that is relatively simple. There's only one estate, and that is the mineral estate. If, however, it's leased, you have now created two estates in the same property, and this is a legal issue. There are now two estates that have been created. One's the leased fee estate, and one is the leasehold estate, and you would appraise them differently. The leased fee estate is the owner of the property, it's the interest they have, and you value that interest, which typically is a royalty income. If it's the leasehold estate, that is the interest that the lessee, i.e. the operator of the property, has, and you would not value that interest on the basis of a royalty income. They require differing valuation methodologies, although both of those estates, the income approach to value can be appropriate. A little bit of a recap on a DCF analysis. There's certain input required. You'll notice I use the word input. Informally, we use the word assumption. I have come to find out in the litigation work I do that you don't want to talk about to the court about the assumptions you made. You want to talk about the input to your model. Assumptions has a very pejorative value in front of a finder of fact. So it's one of the first things your lawyer will beat you over the head with is say, don't use the A word, okay? So we're talking about input. In a leased fee estate, that's the landowner's interest. Basically, the key things that you have to put in your model is the amount of the reserves that are present, anticipated annual production, anticipated selling price, royalty rate, administrative expenses. Yes, there can be administrative expenses to owning a leased property. You have to do something with that income. Time period involved in the discount rate. On the leasehold estate, which is the operator's estate, now you have to go a little deeper when you fight to figure out what you're appraising. You might be appraising the business enterprise value. You might be appraising the value of the mineral asset itself. And there are different techniques used to get there. But basically, you need to know a few of the same key things. The amount of reserves that are present, anticipated annual production, selling price. Now you get into production costs, both direct and indirect. You get into royalties, fees, and production-related taxes. You still need to know the time period. You still need to have a discount rate. If you're doing it on an after-tax basis, then you would also need to factor in depletion, depreciation, amortization, capital requirements, and income tax rates. All of these items that I've listed here are individual, singular inputs to a financial model. Now we deal with what the issue is in running a model. It's the concept of uncertainty. Some call it risk. Some will argue that risk can be quantified, whereas uncertainty can't. Quantified in the sense that the insurance industry has actuarial tables, and they can come up with a risk of putting a policy in place for a person of a certain age and so forth, and you quantify that risk. But I prefer to use the term uncertainty because you can't quantify uncertainty. Everyone, I think, will agree that the net present value is sensitive to varying degrees regarding the likely occurrence of each of the inputs. We've got multiple inputs. None of them is actually with rarity. The royalty rate typically is, and tax rates often are. But most of the inputs are not absolute. You select an input, but by no means is that an absolute value. Forecasts of future and performance, of future conditions in a mine are very difficult to anticipate. As anybody that's ever been involved in the operation of a mine will tell you, every day is a new beginning, basically. And performance has varying degrees of uncertainty associated with that. This gets into management and operating issues, workforce issues, things like that, that affect the performance of that operation. In my experience, this is where I'm trying to pull this back together now. It's been common practice for the potential acquirer of a mineral-bearing property or operation to prepare a DCF model as part of its analysis. Okay, I think everyone in the room will probably sign off on that statement. And It is my further experience that a single model is rarely used to establish a purchase price. If you work with any company doing mergers, doing acquisition work, and you're involved in the evaluation of properties and/or operations for acquisition, they typically will construct a base case model, and then they really get to work. The base case model, in some regards, is the simplest model to construct. Then they start looking at these various impacts of uncertainty can have, how sensitive that model is to changing the input. And so they'll do some form of sensitivity analysis. It varies from company to company. But I can say in all honesty that I can't recall an acquisition of any significance where the acquirer that I was working with or involved in ran a single model and said, that's it, that's what we'll pay for the operation or the property. Rather, a series of models are typically constructed. That's what I said. They'll run sensitivity cases. And some of the key items that are varied in these models are the timing and volumes of production. Obviously, that has a profound impact on the net present value. If you're doing the leasehold estate, the leasehold estate, I'm sorry, forecast operating costs are exceedingly sensitive. Changes in demand, market issues are sensitive, and we've heard that much of the presentation today were about volatility in these commodities, and forecast selling prices, which is the same type of issue as far as market conditions. Now, I'm going to bring this right back then to where I started about market value, and that's what we're trying to establish. If the standard of value you're using is market value, my question to you is, shouldn't the appraisal practice or technique you use reflect what market participants would do? That's the gist of what my paper's about, and I believe that it is. Talk a little bit about techniques. I'll give you two case studies, and I'm addressing in this. There's a number of approaches: Monte Carlo simulation. There's other statistical models that can be run. But one form, and one that we use routinely, is a probabilistic technique. You take the key input, and I'll step back and say one thing that's often people will say to me, but all that's so subjective when you start saying, well, what if I alter this and what if I alter that? What they forget is that the input that went into it's subjective. I mean, that's no secret. The whole freaking model is subjective. So when somebody will come back at me and say, well, yeah, but when you start saying, what if I change 5 years of life to 10 years, or I say price will go up and down, that's subjective. I agree. Just as everything else basically in that model is subjective. So one approach is the probabilistic approach, where you pick your key items, and you can get carried away with this. You're not going to alter every input in that model 3, 4, 5 different ways. You've got a model so complex you can't deal with it. What we try to do, and what has worked for me in the past, what I think holds merit, is you try to select, basically you do a base case. You start out with a base case. And for the certain key inputs that it's very sensitive to, you try to bracket what you think the reasonable range of occurrences will be. You don't try to do every price increase. You don't try to do every change in productivity or reserve issues and so forth. In your experience and what you think that others in the industry, those that you are working with, the market people, what is likely going to bracket the range of these changes? Within what range will they likely fall? And you can often look at historical issues and you can figure out reasonable ranges. So you might run no more than 3 cases. You might alter price upside and a downside and say that's the likely range within which I get it. So I'm starting out with setting the range. And this is what was done in this particular example I'm giving you right here. This was a retrospective appraisal of a heavy mineral sand deposit. The property had been gifted into a trust, and they had to go back and establish what the basis was on that. So that's why the appraisal was retrospective. It went back about 5 years. At the date of the gifting, which was 5 years previously, a lease was under negotiation. It hadn't been signed, The terms had been agreed to, but it had not been signed. It was with a producer in the region. So everybody would say, wow, that's a slam dunk. We'll just factor that lease in because it's basically assured that they're going to get that lease. Well, the problem is they didn't. The lease was to be executed 2 weeks after the retrospective date, after the date it was gifted. And for whatever reason, the whole deal fell apart. So 5 years later, when I'm appraising it, at the date of the gifting, what do? I put myself in the shoes of someone back there at 5 years ago looking forward. I can't just factor in and say, well, the lease never happened. That's easy enough. I can easily do that. So I had to develop a couple of alternatives, and I developed 4 alternatives. A base case, which assumed that the lease would be entered into within the year following the appraisal date, and that production would begin in 4 years. That was the mine plan that had been sold to the property owner, that this is how much production there would be. The delay case, where I said the sensitivity to delay in the lease is significant. So if you move the lease back, you get a separate case. The third was a no mining case. That assumes that you got the lease, but it was never developed, and there were lease payments in the lease. So that case still would have generated an income to the landowner. And the alternative 4 is the no lease case, which, as it turns out, was what happened. But at the time, you wouldn't have known that. But if I had been appraising it at that date, I still would have factored that in because there's absolutely no assurance. One of the biggest mistakes I think can be made, and some of this is experienced in litigation arbitration in front of a finder of fact. You can run a series of sensitivity models, but if there's one alternative you leave out, you'll get nails for it. And that alternative is it won't happen. People leave that out. They'll run a whole series of models and change all these things, but they will not incorporate in their analysis the alternative that says this isn't going to happen. And a finder of fact will beat you up with that because they're coming back to you and saying, Mr. Stagg, are you telling me there's an absolute certainty that these things are going to happen? And I know better. I can't say that. So basically what we did, we set up those 4 alternatives. 2 of them use the income, well, 3 of them use the income approach, depending on the alternative. Alternative 3 was the leased but not mined, and so that had some front-end payments that were to come through. And alternative 4 was nothing happened, and therefore, nothing, there was no income. Now you could say, why wouldn't you use the comp sales approach as an alternative? Very simply, it's a fee-simple property. It's in a prime agricultural area, and if there's no mining, there is substantial value already in the property for agricultural purposes. And I was not asked to value that. I was asked to value because what was gifted was the mineral estate. And if that mineral estate was not developed, it essentially had negligible value, other than perhaps rejoining it with the surface estate. So I developed those 4 alternatives. I stepped back and said, in my opinion, there's probably a reasonable 75% likelihood that the lease will happen and that mining will occur. But I know the mining industry, and so I know how plans are. So I gave that equal weight between the planned case and a delayed case. The alternative 3, leased but not mined, I said probably 20% probability. And alternative 4, that nothing would happen, 5% probability. Now, in my opinion, at the date of the gifting, that would have been reasonable. Which one of those happened? Alternative 4. The one I gave a 5% probability to, and I think most of you in the room would agree, I probably wasn't beating it up too bad if I'd been standing back then and said it had a 5% probability. I have another alternative model. I have a red sign that says stop, so I will stop. being a wise man that I am.
So how did you treat these numbers? Did you multiply the probability?
Yeah, I weighted it. Yeah, that didn't go that far, but it's basic. No, but I've got this one I didn't think I needed to, but I got one that's really complex. It'd take another 10 minutes to show that one. But yeah, it had 4 or 5 sets of variables, and basically we did a probability diagram, and it just keeps going out like a decision tree. And you multiply through each one of those, and you come up with that. And I will say this in closing. I don't say that that number necessarily is the value. That is these are indications of value. You still have to do a little thinking about it and reconcile that. Is that realistic? It might be the value you use, or it might not. But it doesn't follow just because you ran a calculation and got an NPV that you now have a market value.
Alan, if you want to stand there for just 1 minute, I suspect there's a question out there. I have time for a question if somebody would like to ask it about it. Could you come up to the microphone, please? Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I just wish I could watch the whole presentation because this was really good.
Maybe I
So
can't, well, I
there was
can't
no
hear you.
question at all.
I'm
I
sorry.
just wanted to watch the whole presentation because it was really good, but you stopped it short.
Oh,
So I had no question.
Let me do one thing. Let me just show you.
we have a minute.
Let me just throw it up on the screen. There's the second one. That's what was done. That's how many alternative models were run. There's a man in the back of the room that recognizes that because he helped me put it together. We worked here.
Thank you very much.